Alrighty. So today I'm going to be presenting um, my project that I've been working on for a while now, and um, I guess a component of why I wanted to create a game like this is because I noticed that there's an underlying deficiency in the type of recreational activity that exists um, for people who want to, you know, to be simply put, to be edified, right? Which is a fancy way of saying to be built up. And so most RPGs, right? Fundamentally, if you look at the game design and also the philosophy behind it, it always tackles the abstraction of warfare, right? Of warfare, and so conflict is the backdrop in which people fundamentally enjoy these games. You can even go from Mario all the way to like Mario and Pokemon all the way to like Call of Duty. It's even though the mechanics are different in philosophy, like in essence, you are quintessentially going through the game, basically trampling and conquering your opponents. And you might want to argue the semantics, whether like, oh yeah, you don't do that in Pokemon, and Pokemon Faint, and da 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 da. But there's literally been an entire game within the series about animal cruelty. So it's like fundamentally, it's undeniable that violence is definitely a a a fundamental like way in which people have expressed their creative power. And for me, most people will generally be like, well, violence is okay and there's nothing wrong with it. No, violence is there's everything wrong with violence. It fundamentally like ruins your psychological like outlook on how you conduct yourself with another human being. And so as a result, the fact that there exists a form of media, whether if it's movies, television, or games, where it predicates on violence being kind of like uplifted, I I was very annoyed by this. And so, brief background, I was originally like agnostic, secular for that matter, and then now I'm uh, of a Christian background. I'm a Seventh Day Adventist Christian, and however, I've also been disenfranchised by the fact that Christian recreational activity is very shallow, very very shallow. I've looked at like even from just like looking at like Christian media that's like kind of been produced, it's very cheesy, and it's very it feels a bit
It's not captivating.
not even captivating, because it doesn't matter whatever, like if what you create is a good product, then therefore it's naturally going to be like engaging. So captivation is not like something you got to chase after, it's just a byproduct. But generally most Christian forms of media is very cheesy, and it doesn't know how to fully express the nuance of the brutality of reality. But then some people will take this to the extreme and basically straight up like add gore and violence so that it just so that it does quote unquote captivate reality. But that's, you don't always do that. And so I noticed that most Christians, when it comes to like creative Christians, tend to lack the structural backbone that could potentially make their creative direction much more refined. And so as a result, for me, I've I'm not an artist in a traditional sense. I don't know how to draw, but I know how to world build, and I also know how to conceptualize mechanics for a game.
Mm.
And so as a result, I decided to look into this direction. And I looked into the tabletop RPG section for what the Christians themselves have created. And so far, it's been very, very, very disappointing. Um, I sound like Paul right now because I'm like giving like harsh rebukes to my fellow brothers and sisters, but like I'm doing this because like I'm giving a very constructive outlook on the reality of a circumstance. So it's not to throw shade or anything. I think that there can definitely be refinement everywhere. And so that hence why I say these things. And so for me, when I like look at other attempts at creating a Christian tabletop game, I've been very disappointed. Um, because it's either very superstitious in its presentation, or it's very like it's blatantly like feels like an organized religion created the product. It
Mm.
it reeks of like organized religion. And for me, you know i I personally have nothing like against people who believe in organized religion, but for me, I believe in this is my vision for a church. I believe in a church where it's like within the side of some with inside of someone's house, and a bunch of neighbors are gathering together at somebody's house to worship. That's how I view a church, you know.
Mm.
Um, because I grew up in Japan, and for us, we didn't really we worshipped in other people's houses, but we also worshipped in like an office space,
Yeah.
quintessentially an office space, or no, I don't think it was an office space. It was actually more so of an apartment that was recontextualized to be a space of a church. So that's how I envision what a church to be, you know, a very humble, you know, space to just worship, um, and understand God's character fundamentally, to study about it. And so for me, when I see like the tabletop RPGs that the Christians themselves made, it does reek of that kind of like superficial organized religion vibe. And for me, I really dislike that. And it pierced my conscience in a negative way. If I was, say, like, I didn't know about Christianity, and I were to play a game like that,
Mm.
I would be very disappointed, actually, because mechanically it also lacks substance. So as a result, God has given me this conviction to really uh, allow his understanding to be intrinsically imprinted in this game, in a way where all of the details and mechanics have a purpose and a reason, and like they all systematically like snap together like this, because that's how I understand the Bible to be. The Bible is very systematic. You can cross-reference like so many different accounts and use the Bible to prove the Bible, or use the Bible to basically wrestle doctrine, and bring all the scriptures together so that there's no contradiction. And so for me, I wanted to like kind of, now we're gonna like back off a bit, and we're just gonna strictly talk about game design. So what I created is called so the game is called Primordial Pilgrimage. um and this is, hold on.
Wait, just real quick, could you try and like reduce the music just a little bit more? Because your voice like fades out and then I don't hear anything.
Right. Like, wait, what do you mean, like, reduce the music?
I'm not sure. It's like you talk and then it just fades out and I'm like, oh, and then it comes back. I'm not sure because I'm trying
Hmm.
to do it on my end, but I'm not sure if I'm doing the right thing.
Let me see if okay, so what about now? Is it doing the fading thing? Is it still doing that?
No, not anymore.
Okay, cool. So so the game is called Primordial Pilgrimage, and even the name for this, like just starting off right off the bat, I like my kind of like testimony for this, for the even the name itself. I was like driving, um, you know, in like the mountains of North Georgia. I just like came back from um a event known as like the Feast of Tabernacles, and
Mm.
and the Feast of Tabernacles is like a biblical event that that took place during ancient Israel, and then during the time of like post Christ's crucifixion. So it's like it's an event that, you know, people gather to remember like how God has brought people out of Egypt. So I went to this like feast event, and it was pretty chill. And and no, we did not sacrifice a lamb. That, you know, that like that's clearly done away with. If we were to go into the semantics. And then I was like driving back after, like, you know, been with this congregation, and then I eventually was like super inspired to, like, you know, in the car I was trying to think of like the names for this game, and then I was like, it's in the beginning, so how should I conceptualize the name for the game? And I was like, well, Primordial sounds epic. And then I was like, and then I was thinking like Primordial Journey. No, that sounds too cliche. Primordial, you know, uh, Primordial Epic. No, that doesn't sound right. And so I was going through a lot of like namings, and then eventually I was like, once I arrived home, I was like, what about like Primordial Pilgrimage? And I was like talking to my friend who's a an editor for like for books and stuff, and like, and he was like, yeah,
Mm.
it sounds pretty chill. And I'm like, all right, cool. So Primordial Pilgrimage is how it came to be. You know, God definitely like had a part in inspiring the name itself. So then after that, and there've been times where I was like kind of tempted to change the name again, but I think I'm just gonna stick with it because it has its own like the even the game's like name has its own contextualization of its like of its history, but also like there's a testimony behind it. So that's why I'm probably gonna keep it. But yeah, so the game's called Primordial Pilgrimage, and the premise starts off as such. In the beginning, Yehovah, through his only begotten Son, created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void. So the Father is Yehovah, and like in the Christian context, for those of you who are not Christian that are watching this, or listening to this or whatever, Yehovah is like just the name of the Father. So, and that in the context, like there is a Father, like God is like the Father, and then he has this Son, and the Son receives all of the attributes of like his Father's like godhood, pretty much. Um, so yeah, these are the events that took place during the time before a worldwide flood. So this is like an antediluvian environment. Antediluvian is like just like a fancy way of saying like pre-flood, people before flood. It was much a different place, and the earth worked differently. And as a result, we learn what they are like. Through witnessing these events, humanity was highly advanced, not just in technology, but also physiologically. The earth was not so harsh whatsoever, meaning biomes with different extremes did not exist. So yeah, like, you know how like we have deserts and like tundras, yeah, it wouldn't have existed in the antediluvian era. As for flora and fauna behaved differently, the world was quite luscious with vegetation, so to see any forms of extremes would be due to man-made causes, due to the technology they had. So another aspect is like animals eating each other, like that wouldn't have like existed in the antediluvian era because there was no deficiency for nutrition. So therefore, like, you wouldn't have a need for a lion to like eat the, you know, eat the herbivores, because the lions would have had a form of plant that would have nourished them. And you know, if you want to argue instinct of like say a lion, Well, lions are also like they use their sense of smell to basically like detect food. So if there's a plant for every creature, then there's definitely going to be a plant for a lion for it to sniff so that it can eat. It was after the flood that we started seeing extremes of like animals that exhibited different violent tendencies. The reality of the beginning was pushed out of the minds of men to be distracted by their endeavors of their own dreams. Abundance is everywhere, and thus actions of selfish intent are everywhere. So this is kind of also a reference to Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom was like abundant with bread, and it was like quintessentially like pre-flood, antediluvian era. Humanity has reached a point in their society that removes which character they want to exhibit, and by doing so, their characters become wrought with pursuits that are in vain, with no way of having peace or longevity. The the only thing that the only thing that remains is by the works of the hands. Life appears fulfilling. Humanity, as a result, began experimenting with animal DNA to extend their lifespan to reach immortality. As a result of this, amalgamations formed from this practice. Humanity is slowly becoming more and more unrecognizable from their point in time. Life looks very dim. To add on top of that, a nation known as Mara to form, and now the people are under this nation. Mara also like is like a Hebrew word for like rebellion. So, so it just that's where the name comes from.
Mm.
And now the people are under this nation. One fateful day. So This is where I'm gonna like voice act a little bit. So hold on. Dreams, good and evil. These ideals are the driving worlds of the wind, or driving winds of the world of Midbar. But it is the very dreams of the people that are in upheaval. The nations are haunted by the journey and death of the infamous sea sovereign, Judge C. Goldman. His final words began turning tides, and their currents rise with greater and greater insistence. You want the true treasure? It's for you. But know this, the treasure that man seeks is not the treasure he needs. Many are called, but few are chosen. Years after the execution, the memory of the words spoken that day ushered forth an ambitious journey to the crossing river. For those that journeyed held on to many dreams that only God knew. Thus, a grand era in history known as the Era of Dreams has begun. So, this is the narrative backdrop in which this fictitious in like setting takes place. Now, all of the inspiration that I took was like basically like my years worth, at least my 3 years worth of like just on and off like researching of like the antediluvian era basically. And so and I came across a lot of documentaries and stuff like that, and different like texts and of like people like writing books about it. And so it's pretty cool. I mean, like, and so it creates an enriching narrative backdrop, and that most people I know for a fact have not been able to really execute properly. And I hope that this game can just surge people with inspiration to really like go out and do something, you know
Yeah.
because like because the problem is that I noticed that the inconsistency as it relates to certain Christian world building is that it lacks like logic as it relates to God's character,
Mm.
because deep down they kind of have there's a smidge of arbitrariness to God, in that God can do anything because he's God, but that's not actually his principles nor his identity nor his character. God has a purpose. God structures things, and there's a logistical reason for why things are the way that they are. It's not just because God is God and therefore he can do anything. And that kind of attitude and sentiment actually comes from the fact that deep down humans like to worship a god of power. Therefore, they always want to make those kind of remarks. And so for me, you know, as a result, I see it manifesting in like Christian creatives, not the Discord server, but just general Christians who are creative, that want
Yeah.
to make art or depictions or media about God. But the problem is that it's like they're close, but they're so far. And so, and I noticed that, and hopefully, like, um my project can be a, sort of like an inspiration to think deeper about God's character. And so,
Mm.
and like definitely like go into to the scriptures for it. So this is basically like the beginning premise for my game. Let's see. So now we're going to the game overview. The purpose of this game is for those who experience it to go through a learning experience that has the potential to understand a different outlook in a fun way. It's a way to understand a side of humanity that's not all too delved upon in our current era, which is the extent of our self-destruction. Another aspect about this game is to lay the glory of man into the dust, and only to realize there is vanity, while at the same time going through a process of understanding what is the remedy to this overall problem that humanity suffers from. If it wasn't clear from the introduction, this system takes place in a world where it's perfect for living. The animals are not hostile towards one another, because of the fact that food is ever so abundant in the form of plants and fruit. This would, as a result, cater to the instinctual needs of the animals, therefore not needing to be hostile, since it wouldn't be logical for them to be hostile. However, if for some whatever reason animals were to be hostile, this would be due to human intervention that would not only affect the physiology of the animals, but also their epigenetics. Mineral deposits are on the surface of the planet. Land masses are not as rigid and jagged as it normally would be in our context. So you know how like Mount Everest is like super rigid and jagged? I'm asking UK like kind of like a rhetorical question.
I'm
Okay.
so sorry, you faded out
Oh,
because of the music.
let me like hold on. Okay, so you know how like um you know how Mount Everest is rigid and jagged, rigid.
Yeah.
Okay. So that would be an example of that, the kind of like the geographical environment of the antediluvian era would be much less of that and more kind of like rounded out mountains.
Yeah.
Kind of like in like Mario or something, actually.
Oh, so would it be more like valleys then?
Yeah, like valleys and like the mountains would be huge though.
Yeah.
But like it wouldn't be like like the climb up is not hostile. Is the intention here? Because the climb up Mount Everest, even if like it's not like, even if it's easy, you can fall and you could literally die because
Mm.
the rocks would like literally jut out and it would pierce you. In the antediluvian environment, the hills were much more rounded out, and so if we ever see any kind of like extreme where say like the hills were not rounded out, then it would be due to like man-made causes, it within the context of the antediluvian era. Now for our context is more so that the flood ended up causing like rifts in the tectonic plates and really like shaped the earth in a different way. So as a result, like, you know the the jagged edges and stuff is just more so caused by the flood. But like say if it happens like in this world, it would be due to man-made inventions that would have terraformed the environment. So that's kind of
Mm.
the I guess
So
the
all of this takes place after the flood?
no, pre-flood.
Pre-flood, okay.
And mineral deposits on the surface of the planet. So that's kind of like, you can just pick up gold or like jewels or whatever, gems. And it's
Yeah.
just, and it's just like, like how you can like walk outside your lawn and like just, rip out a piece of grass. It would be kind of like that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Most importantly, there is no rain, and instead the planet hydrates the plants through a mist system that would be expelled from the ground. So this is you can also have like there's a agriculturally you can prove this as well, that there's a way where you can effectively hydrate plants where they have um like a hose and that spouts out mist, and basically like the mists would seep into the pores underneath the actual leaves of the plants, and as a result plants can get effective hydration through that as well as their root systems. So most people think, oh well, plants just get hydrated through their roots. Not quite. It's actually both. They get hydrated through their roots, but they also get hydrated through the pores underneath the plant leaves, which is very effective way to hydrate plants.
Mm.
So yeah, so as you're kind of like seeing the exploration of this environment, you're noticing that it's very different in context. There's a lot of different things going on. So then the game gets divided up into two like selections basically. The narrative expositor is basically the guy who runs the game, right? And so his purpose is to set up the story structure, the adventure, the encounters by using pre-existing narrative set pieces within the world of Midbar, or making their own narrative set pieces within the world of Midbar or some other location they choose to desire. Narrative set pieces can include things such as non-playing characters, trade encounters, mobilization encounters, which is a fancy way of saying combat, um, role-playing slash acting, story description in relation to traveling, and so much more. However, lastly, their job is also to understand the relation. I would say the relational entity of this game's lore, i.e., simply put, Yehovah himself and his only begotten Son, because in other games, you definitely want to know the lore of like the deities that exist in that game. Well, the only like actual deity that exists in this game is the Father and his only begotten Son. That's it. The purpose and then so that's the role of the narrative expositor. Their job is to basically know the functionality of how this game is. And so the purpose of the opportunists, which are I actually have to like relabel that. They're called journeyers actually. So I changed it. The purpose of the journeyers, basically the players. So these guys are just the guys who create their own little characters and they play through the story and the game. Is to live through the adventure that the narrative expositor provides. They're supposed to create a character that suits them and fits within the narrative structure of whatever the setting that the narrative expositor provides. The any would provide the setting, theme, expectations, and idea for the narrative structure for the game. This would act as a border to work off of. So that's kind of the overview. So far, like, we're just like only in the introductionary phases of this presentation. So we're gonna actually like start going into like the deeper aspects about this game. So this game has different mechanics that exist, and not all of the mechanics are finished, and and not all of them are fully developed. The problem is that is fundamentally like this takes a lot of time and patience. So and it definitely requires a lot of like life experience to come to conclusion thereof. So yeah, like and I'll get into it here just a bit actually. I'm just gonna okay, cool. So at the very beginning, there's this thing called an attribute system, which is basically this. It's the attributes are like the stats for my game, what I've labeled as stats. And so you have different types of attributes. And I recently I made a text post about this in my like personal like in my game development like Discord server for this game. And so I'll read it off of like the dev log. So hold on. Let's see. Um. Well, actually, I'll just do some like simple explanation actually. So the way that this works is that the game has 6 different attributes, and it goes from fitness, vitality, um, temperance, social, intelligence, and creative. And I have a very very specific purpose as to why I organize this in the way that it is, and it went through 2 iterations. And so this was like my previous iteration. However, I realized that this is very confusing, and so eventually I was like, well, to I want it to be much more concise. So like, and this was like kind of like the diagram that I created about like the relational mechanism of how these attributes would relate to one another. But fundamentally, it is now fitness. The fitness attribute, or FA, is at the very bottom, because fundamentally it is literally the biological mechanism for you to be able to move. I mean, I think that's an important foundation. And then it goes into vitality, which is basically your diet, and your genetics or whatever, right? So your fitness, and then it relates to this. So it's kind of like they're related to one another, but more like vitality is actually what's the crucial like crux of all of this. So kind of like FA would be like the roots, and like VA would kind of be like the trunks of the tree, and then TA is like your temperance. So um that's like your ability to have discipline, be resolute, persevere, and express gratitude, sort of deal. So there's that. And then it was split. So relationally, like, temperance would have different kind of relational mechanism to intelligence and social. So so then you have your social mechanic, how your character like basically acts in a social environment. And then you have your intelligence attribute, which is how your character acts intellectually. um, and then it would all funnel, because the idea is that these 2 experiences kind of like funnel into what would generate their creativity. Basically, how would they express their creativity through the social and intelligence experience that they have encountered in their life. Because fundamentally, what I've learned is that artists are, like, the reality of the artist is that they are inspired by life and what they go through, and what their intellectual experience has been and what their social experience has been. So fundamentally, their creative output is affected by their environment. And I mean, it makes sense. You're using your brain to express like images on the paper. So it's pretty straightforward when I really think about it. But then on top of that, it's not just your social experiences and your intelligence experiences, but it's also your temperance experiences. Your discipline, your ability to express gratitude and stuff like that. That requires a lot of willpower. And then also the overall health and condition of a creative person will affect their creative output. Like, if you eat healthy and if aren't constantly feeding yourself garbage, you're gonna have a very clear mind. It's literally like it's written in nature that God created. And we see that. and then obviously your fitness will also affect like how you express your creative prowess through like physical means. So there's that. Um, let's see. So that's the organization of the stats itself, and so and so, aka the attributes. As a result, I when I first organized the stats, this was like last year in May 23, May 23, 2022. And this was sort of the original structure of the stats. As you can see, it was very unrefined. And then eventually I updated it like 2 days later. And then it became this. You had it was kind of organized but for this one, creativity was like sandwiched between body and mind, which, like my thought process at the time was like, oh yeah, you use creativity for your physical things, so therefore they should be sandwiched between, but that doesn't make sense entirely. So I had to really refine that, and just kind of place it elsewhere. So you have your fitness attribute, your vitality, and these are just kind of like general descriptions rather than like an actual mechanic per se. And even vitality, I wrote principles of the mechanics. So I basically started off with principles first before I got into the actual mechanism, except for this one. This is actually the first ever mechanic I've ever conceptualized, which is the perseverance / patience / willpower mechanic, which is how much annoyance / adversity one is able to handle. And so this is, I'm probably going to refine this once I get around to refining temperance, but yeah. And then eventually I had a secondary update during June where I added like where I basically like just revised the word confidence, which is not much. And then April I added gratitude because this was during the time of Passover, and this one pastor was from Australia, and he was like giving a other side of the world presentation. He was presenting from the other side of the world, and like it was through like the internet, and he mentioned about gratitude and the aspect thereof, and how it was the gratitude of Mary that was able to really help her to be faithful and patient, and during the time where the begotten Son was being crucified, that she didn't run away because of her gratitude, whereas the other disciples actually did not yield gratitude. In fact, when she washed the feet of the begotten Son using her hair and basically like an alabaster, I don't know, it was like expensive oil, that was like, that action was a physical manifestation of her gratitude towards the begotten Son. But guess what? This gratitude, this expression of gratitude, enraged the disciples because they were not grateful. And as a result, when you don't have gratitude, the reality is that you're going to run away from the begotten Son when the begotten Son is being crucified. And so it was a very powerful punchline that I was like, whoa, I gotta like add this to my game. And that's what happened. And so as a result, that's how the gratitude mechanic exists within temperance.
So do these attributes like either build a relationship with NPCs or draw you closer to God, or
So
both?
it can do both actually. So it can be able to, like, for example, a prime example is this. Okay, we're gonna go to the very updated circumstance. So I like, this is where like the revision happened, and there's like 24 different edits, and I was with my my friend PJ, and he made a different tabletop game called Antediluvian, and his main one, which is called Tribulation, and
Mm.
and you know, to answer your question, yes, these attributes, these mechanics within the attributes, each attribute does do something as it relates to the relational experience that the player goes through when they play this game. So say like I am not really a Christian, right?
Yeah.
These attributes still can be applicable to how you relate with an NPC. And say I am a Christian, these attributes are applicable when you relate with God. So that's the punchline. And
Okay.
and that's a really cool dynamic. And I'll actually go into what kind of sort of dynamic that you'll get into. So now we're gonna so a year later. So notice that this page hasn't been up. It hasn't really been updated for an entire year, like at least in a substantial way, which is very interesting. You know, it took an entire year for me to eventually get around this, but that's because I was also exploring other subjects about the game. So how am I going to set so then like I was organizing with PJ, and you know PJ was able to really see my thought process, like just kind of come to fruition, how I think and how I like systematically kind of like chip away at all of the obstacles that I go through when it comes to like game design. So you know, one thing is like, how am I going to set in order the attributes for this game? What I mean by that is more so how am I going to and the reason why I write those two questions down is more so of a checklist of things that I can do to move forward this project. So I start off with a question, and then I think, so how am I going to organize the attributes for the game? So the problem is that just because I have this model doesn't mean I know how these things are going to relate to one another. The idea is that they're going to relate to one another, but the question that hasn't been answered is how. How on earth is temperance going to like relate with intelligence and social? Doesn't make sense because it's not there. The mechanic isn't there yet. And so as a result, I have to really conceptualize how am I going to organize the layout of this game. And so as a result, I this is where I started thinking about character sheets. See, fundamentally, when I look at a character sheet like D&D or Pathfinder or any of that nature, generally it looks like I'm looking at an Excel sheet. But also there's a problem fundamentally when I look at it, or at least a I see it as a problem. People may not, because they're not like thinking in the same wavelength that I'm thinking. And that is that these stats are just segmented. They're all compartmentalized. They don't relate with one another. Like me having a high wisdom isn't going to affect my intelligence in some way, shape, or form, because fundamentally, D&D doesn't have that in mind when they develop their game, because the way that D&D was designed from the ground up in the first place was that it was going to be it was a war game that was going to basically emulate Tolkien's adventures through Mordor or whatever, and like there was going to be a lot of hacking and slashing, you know, going from dungeon to dungeon. That's how it was designed. And so now, like 5 different generations later, we just see that it's the same concept as it was, just much more advanced. You're not necessarily going through dungeons, but but definitely there's a deeper aspect about the role playing, but fundamentally the game still revolves around combat. And as a result, most of these stats are going to accommodate to combat. Even if people may want to disagree and say, I've played in games where this, and this happened and we didn't fight. The reality is that the bulk of D&D's content, all of the classes, all of the spells, all of the things that, you know, people create mods for, the homebrew, is generally for the mechanism of warfare. And it's undeniable. You can have like narrative, you know, expansions or whatever, but most of those narrative expansions hinge upon you basically like having a conflict resolution situation where it deals with either you fight this thing or not. And for me, mechanically speaking, this is very this is, you know, not the game that I want to design, because it already exists. So why do I want to design something that's already existing? You know? And people could say, well, it works. I'm like, well, that's cool, but I want to innovate. I don't want to just stick to the same puzzle formula that works. I want to innovate because I know that God's character and his identity is to innovate things that are the foolishness of men, but instead it is the wisdom, and as a result it manifests into the wisdom of God. So for me, when I look at, you know, a character sheet like this, you know, fundamentally, like, you know, it's kind of like the attacks and spellcasting are at the very center, and you know, the social interactions, the things that are not combat is just put off to the side. And it's kind of symbolic to me because for me personally, this is the core gameplay versus this and this. This and this we turned into the core mechanic now, but prior to that, this was the core mechanic. You know, this here, this right here. This story stuff was not that much of a thing. Like it was not an emphasis back in the day. It's just the reality. And even the skills themselves are like, it's very questionable. Like deception, right? Intimidation, you know, sleight of hand, which is generally used for stealing, stealth, like, which is used to, you know, well, it's used to hide, but generally it's used to abuse. So you have these mechanics that kind of are centered around like rewarding bad behavior, basically. um there's no like, I don't see a mechanic about like patience or like, or you know, I don't see a mechanic about, I don't know, like confidence. It doesn't exist, because it only like, because most of these things are gamified because people feel like, oh, I keep running into this situation a lot, I'm going to gamify it now, and as a result that's how they came to be. And for me, the situations that you're going to encounter in a game like mine is going to be very different from the situations you'll encounter in D&D, and that's just a fact. So as a result, I was like, when I wanted to design the character sheet, I have to think about like how I'm going to design it. So I started like looking at different stuff, like this is really cool actually. It's a pictographic, like, it's a pictographic way of like understanding like the character sheet itself. They're all stats ultimately, but the way that you organize them is much more visually interesting to look at. And so for me, you know, even this, like, this is like, you know, this has it's a diagram of things to like basically like input rather than just an Excel sheet. So for me, what I came to the conclusion is that how I would organize the stats is more so that I would create a design, like in the form of a tree. And so as a result, I answered the first question, which is create a pictographic diagram known as the tree model that connects all these attributes. So that's how I came to the conclusion of the tree model. And then obviously, how exactly is the creativity mechanic going to work? I'm going to eventually answer that question, but I have yet to answer it. So there's that. So then you have like your attributes. So you have like I categorized it as body and mind, and there's two. There's body. So for like the body categories, there's two, and then for the mind, there's four. The reason why I didn't put like a spirit or anything is that it's just kind of unnecessary, um, because of the fact that like you can't really quantify like uh, you can't quantify that ultimately. It's just, and so that as a result, I like just chose not to. Um, but you know, if people say like, well, you can, and da, 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 okay, well, you know, feel free to give me an understanding and a conceptualization and see if it like, and I'll look into it and see if I could like fit it in. But I don't think it's necessary for my game personally. So prior, you know, originally like before I, you know, updated this, it looked like this, and eventually I like updated the vitality attribute, and now it looks like this. So I have to figure out like in tabletop in D&D, generally there's like when you have a stat, there's usually an active kind of like skill within that stat, and then a passive one. So for example, like um in D&D, an active stat for like constitution, which is like health, would be like would be to roll for constitution saves, you know, or to roll for constitution, right? Whereas a passive stat for constitution, like a passive skill for constitution, is less of a skill and more so of like the actual overall HP of the game itself. And so and so that's when I realized like, oh, then I should understand like what are the passive stats for vitality and what are the active ones. And then I came to the conclusion of like of just organizing them. So, you know, like resilience, I could definitely roll for, like I could imagine me like rolling for resilience. Durability, I can imagine myself rolling durability. Immune system, I could imagine rolling for immune system. But epigenealogy, which is like, you know, just your epigenetics of understanding the lineage that you went through, um, that's, I would perceive that as passive. Physical genetics, that's pretty passive, because you don't actively like say I'm gonna roll for my physical genetics. Like it's just doesn't make sense. It's just kind of like what you have. So eventually I'll have to create a mechanic for all of these, but for now this is the label that I'm gonna put. Dietary pattern. So even that's like very passive. Okay, so then this is where like I got into like the mind category, and the attributes thereof. So hold on. So basically, prior, my social attribute did not look this detailed. In fact, it looked like this. It's a very drastic shift in how much it's changed. So bear with me. I highlighted this because it needs more work, but eventually I'll figure out a way to really mechanize all of this. But for now, I'm just gonna go with like the basic ones, like charisma is like pretty straightforward. You know, your ability to influence, good or bad. See that I like this one more compared to like what D&D has, which is like this is more neutral. You know, you can choose to do evil or whatever, but eventually I'll have like a mechanism where if you do misuse your charisma, then I'm gonna have like a different mechanic, that, you know, that initiates some form of like some form of deficiency. So there's that, and then the self-awareness mechanic is actually pretty cool. So this is more like the intuitive ability to realize and recognize one's own individuality / personality. And the example is like the narrative expositor insinuates an opportunity to roll so that the players are able to role play out what they're internally going through, or if they even have the capacity to acknowledge it or not. So in play, you would see this. You would use this to see if your character can recognize an insult or praise, or like, you know, if Does your character? It's kind of like you roll to see if your character really understands what's going on, basically. The reason for this is so that a player can properly role play out their character in a way where it's consistent instead of the player role playing out role playing as how they feel in person in the moment. So this is also like a way, because I noticed the problem is that, like, say like, an NPC insults the player actually gets offended instead of the actual character themselves. But because the player is like, I control my character, therefore I get to do whatever I want. They'll kind of use their feelings to project onto the character, or through the character. And so for me, this is sort of a kind of like a checks and balance to give like a double take. Like, are you sure your character will do this? And this exists in mechanism form. So, and you roll for it. Astute, keenly perceptive and socially aware. So this is more so like seeing if the seeing if the vibe of the room is chill or heated, or if they're able to learn a lesson in what their character is presented with. Kind of like this is more so like, say, like an actual like a player who is actually physically charismatic. Like, they know how to talk, they know how to portray the character, but subconsciously they'll do things that, even though they're like not trying to, they'll do things where they'll extend and break character at times. And astute is basically like a way for your character to understand, like, is a way for you to kind of like roll to see if your character gets it rather than you getting it. You know what I mean? So the social attribute, I noticed that it exists so that it basically like it keeps the consistency of the role play itself. And that's what I noticed here. And then eventually courage and confidence. I have not fully developed that, so I'm not gonna really like talk about it too much, but it's just generally it has to deal with like let's say, so for confidence, or like for courage, for example, like, or no, confidence. If somebody is like saying like, I want to go and Leroy Jenkins this thing, you would have to roll for confidence to see if your character would even do that in the first place, rather than you as a player saying, yeah, my character would do this. This is more so to still keep in the consistency of your character, so that you don't break character, pretty much. And then that's basically like what I've developed so far as it relates to like the attributes. So there's that. And then this is like the checklist. So I guess like I'll put like in progress for like the attributes. But conflict resolution mechanics. So that's basically having to deal with like, so in this game, you're not only gonna have like an actual character like stat thing. Your character is also going to, yeah. So your fictional character is also going to have jobs, like what they do, their trade, their occupation, and they're gonna have two. One, I labeled as heavy duty, and one I labeled as like domiciliary, which is basically like they're gonna have, for example, like they're a blacksmith, but they also are a seamster, or like a sewer or whatever. And so as a result, like when you look at like just the overall trade itself, I realize like the conflict resolution mechanic in this game is not just only like your interaction with other human beings, but also you actually doing projects and basically going into this sort of like battle sequence, quote unquote, to overcome this project that you got to complete. And so the trades you pick up have certain abilities that can help you to chip away the project or the progress of said project, and therefore basically like netting you money and like influence and whatnot. So it's kind of like Pokemon, or like other RPGs, but instead of like fighting monsters and things, you fight by working on a project. That's it. And so hence and this mechanic is definitely going to be like important for a game like mine, because the idea is that I'm taking this from the specific commandment, the fourth commandment: 6 days you shall do, you know, 6 days you shall do all your labor and do all your work, right? And then on the seventh day you shall rest, which is the Sabbath, the seventh day Sabbath. And so, yeah, what's up?
Have you tried including like the concept of like spiritual warfare and stuff like that into like the system of the game, or would that not fit your game at all?
So spiritual warfare actually is very interesting, because eventually I will incorporate a spiritual like warfare kind of detailing, but it's not gonna be like in a way that, you know, that's gamified strictly by its mechanism. And I'll say this why. Because it's ultimately, spiritual warfare is like one of the most nuanced things that you physically can't quantify, because it's not a matter of quantifiability, it's a matter of decision making that has a chain reaction of events. So it's more like spiritual warfare in our current like in real life. Spiritual warfare is all relational, rather than like, you know, say for example like JoJo's Bizarre Adventures, where you have invisible ghosts fighting each other. It's not like that, but it's more like,
Yeah.
give me a second.
Okay.
So so because it's all relational, it's strictly going to be narrative. And the reason why I say that is because that's how it is in real life. Spiritual warfare is strictly relational when you really look at it from like a big picture standpoint. Is that people are influenced not because, oh, they just like suddenly wanted to do something out of impulse, but there would have been series of accumulated like decisions that they would have made that would have led them to what they do now. And that's the very complicated nuance of spiritual warfare. So as like a world
Yeah.
builder, I noticed that that hence why I removed the spirit as like a, like, you know, mind body, you know, and I removed the spirit as a mechanic. The reason why is that the spirit is actually a relational is the relational mechanic of the entire game. And I don't even want to call it mechanic. It's the relational experience of the entire game itself. Because the
Oh,
reality,
okay.
yeah. So as a result, when addressing spiritual warfare, it's more like it's more like I have to like write details about how entities would function, you know, and detailing out like how they operate, what kind of sort of principles do they abide by, um, and how is it antithetical to God's character. So there's that. And then the dice, man. Oh man, this is very interesting too. So the dice, I eventually like had to really consider even the dice itself. You know, I had to like, you know, most systems roll like you know, the popular systems roll like a 20-sided dice. And so I'm like thinking to myself, you know, like this, like, is dice evil? Right? I had to really simply just ask that question, and I had to like pray about it and like and do a lot of research about it. My conclusion is more so that because of the nature of the dice, and how human beings like to be addicted to being gratified by chance, it's very very easy for it to go really wrong, and wrong in a sense of like it satisfies the fleshly nature of wanting, like, basically to gamble. We may not physically gamble, we may not throw away all our money, but the fact that the dice rolled the 20, even though we, even though we didn't like say drink ourselves to death or whatever, because we, um, whatever it is, right? Like the stimulation is still there of like your dopamine like firing off when you're able to get that like when you're able to basically win the game of chance. And that is the thing that I basically was like thinking to myself, do I want, like, is that okay? And I came to a conclusion, no, it's not okay. But then I came to another like question: is probability evil? And then I went to like a complete like thorough study about probability and statistics and whatnot. And I came to a conclusion where it's like, no, actually probability is not evil, because it's a guided expression of order in the process of randomization. So it's a series of randomization that's basically like combined together to actually have a much more of a consistent trend of outcomes. And as a result, because it's orderly and because it has a consistency, it's actually, it's pretty fair to say that it's not really evil, because we're not really playing the game of chance when we start adding probability into the mix, because then we're more so looking at like, okay, well, this is the predictable reality, and so therefore that's it. And then and then I was like, okay, how do I design how the mechanism of my dice works? So this is what I came to. It's like a progression system. So at the very beginning, you start off with a d20 and the d20 is in my game is like symbolized as like the unrefined nature of man, right? And then over time, you basically like progress through, and you basically have like a combination of dice to basically roll for. And so the more, and as a result, you, instead of going from like a 5 point like a 5% chance on a number you want to roll, and that's like the d20, it's like statistically it's like very random. When you start adding other dice into the mix, not like, so you graduate from a d20 to like a 12-sided dice plus an 8-sided dice or something like that, you start having a bell curve, which is a fancy way of saying a consistency of numbers that you can basically roll. And and I chose this route because it's an expression of a consistency in what we do as human beings, but it doesn't completely remove the ability of probabilities of different experiences and events that could occur in our life, because we humans are not designed to be omniscient, in a sense where not just to know all things, but to see every 50 billion like possibilities that could ever happen. And so as a result, for me, I chose this dice mechanic as a way to account for is to leverage out like the unpredictable probabilities that we could go through in life, you know. And so hence why I chose, so that's like my design philosophy. And it's also actually an expression of God's character, in that God, when he sent his son, there was a risk. There was a risk in his son to be eternally lost forever. There was a risk. If there was no risk, then the entire process of the cross would have meant nothing. Because then it would mean that God was basically allowing his son to perform a play, and that it was just a chess game. And that is a disservice to the entire atonement. Like, it sickens me to say that people have this view of the atonement, but there was a risk in God sending his only begotten son, because his son could have died forever, or his son could have been tempted, because he was in a situation where he can be tempted, and it's all game over. So praise the Lord that never happened. But there was a risk, and his son volunteered, and his father allowed his son to volunteer. And the reason why that there was this risk in the first place is not because the father demanded blood for his own son so that there can be forgiveness of sin, but because we humans are so warped in our own justice system that we needed to see an innocent man dying on that cross so we can believe that we were forgiven. We needed death to satisfy our view of justice. And so that's why that happened. There's a verse, sacrifices and sin offerings I did not require. I did not need any death in the first place. It's just you humans, once you believed in the lie of Satan, required death. And as a result, you worshipped a God of an unforgiving judge. And so Christ had to break that curse because humans wanted blood. And so there was a risk in sending the Son of God to this earth. And so the dice mechanic is actually a celebration of the divine risk that was expressed during the time of Jesus. So there's that. And I think I'm gonna end it off here. Like I have other I do have to go eat, but this is like where next time I'll talk about the premise and the professions and the affliction system and the combat technology system and whatnot, and this, that, and other. So, but yeah.